It's easy to spend money. It's very hard to make a difference. And the whole point of being in government, the whole point of good government, is not just to splash cash on every problem, it's to make a difference. And funding more bureaucrats, charging around the countryside where they manage problems without really addressing them, it's just not what the public expect.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. Hello Tony and g'day to all of our viewers. Great to be back. Today we'll be talking about the election campaign, what's happening with Trump's America, and Tony's visit to London for the ARC conference. Tony, great to be back with you.
Thanks, Dan. Lovely to be here.
All right, well, let's start on the domestic front. Over the last couple of days, Labor has basically kicked off its election campaign in Tasmania with their effective launch of their campaign, focusing on Medicare, which very much looks like a redo of 2016. Saying that the Liberals and Dutton are going to cut Medicare and committing money to it, then the Liberals have matched them on their commitment. So, look, Tony, obviously they think that the Liberals are vulnerable when it comes to health and when it comes to Medicare. Very interested in your assessment of how Labor has started the pseudo campaign.
Well, you're right. This is the campaign in all but name. And it's interesting that the Labor Party is basically running just a giant scare, a giant smear against Peter Dutton. It's not just the false claim that Peter Dutton would cut Medicare. It's not just false claims that he did in fact cut Medicare, but there's a whole lot of absolute nonsense suggesting that there might have been insider trading simply because as an opposition health shadow, he bought some bank shares at the time of the GFC. I mean, Labor's dirt unit is in overdrive, and what this does is simply indicate how desperate the government is. A government with no record to run on and no plan for the future attacks the other side, and that's all we're going to see between now and polling day from the government. Let's just focus on this health issue because Peter Dutton was my health minister for some time. As a former health minister myself, I know something about this. When Peter Dutton was the minister, there were no cuts to Medicare. There were no cuts to health. In fact, health spending went up and up and up. Yes, the 2014 budget did scale back the rate of increase in the final out year, but that was exactly what we'd said we would do in the 2013 election campaign. We said that we would commit to the Gillard cash splash on hospitals, but only for the then budget period, which of course came back a year in 2014. So there were no broken promises on health. There was no reduction in spending. In fact, one of the big deals of the 2014 budget was that any extra money that we were going to raise through the Medicare co-payment was going to be invested in the Medical Research Future Fund, which Peter Dutton set up, which has now expanded to some $22 billion in capital, and which is putting at least $1 billion a year over and above what would otherwise be spent into our outstanding world-leading health scientific researchers. So I used to say this when I was the health minister, that the Howard government was the best friend that Medicare had ever had. Certainly that continued under Peter Dutton, and it continued under the coalition government with both Turnbull and Morrison as Prime Minister. In fact, at the May 2022 election, the bulk billing rate was 88%. It's under Albanese that the bulk billing rate has collapsed to 78%. So it's Anthony Albanese who has presided over a Medicare bulk billing crisis, not Peter Dutton. So look, this is just an absolute pack of lies. See it for what it is. Now, when it comes to health policy, I've got to say that had it been me, I probably would have rejigged and boosted the GP rebate, because under Gillard and subsequently, the GP rebates were frozen for quite a long time. The GP rebate provides an incentive for what doctors call 6-minute medicine, because there's a lesser rebate for consultations of less than 6 minutes, and it's got to be a consultation of over 20 minutes before the rebate goes up. If you want better quality general practice, and we do, if you want a better class of graduate going into general practice, and we do, you've certainly got to boost overall GP incomes, because GPs are the poor relations of the profession these days, even though after the patient himself or herself, the GP is the nearest thing that you've got to a health manager. That's why it's important to have a good GP. So you'd probably extend the length of the basic consultation to, say, 10 minutes, and then you'd up the rebates, which have not kept pace with inflation and really do deserve a substantial increase. So had my advice been sought, that's what I would have been recommending. As it is, the government is obsessed with bulk billing, which certainly has its place, but it's not the be-all and the end-all. And all it's going to do with this extra money is produce, I think, more 6-minute medicine, which, is a suboptimal outcome. And of course, it's yet another unfunded major spending commitment on top of a whole series of unfunded major spending commitments by this government, which has taken federal government spending as a percentage of GDP to an absolutely record level in peacetime. And in the end, this ain't a free gift from government. This is all money coming out of taxpayers' pockets. And I honestly think that we're better at spending our own money than government is.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big problems, which is, I guess, so many in the community now have become accustomed to government spending of some form. And, your budget in 2014 was the last earnest attempt to rein in government spending and try to get debt and deficit on a sustainable trajectory. And really, I guess I wonder, particularly with an ageing population and more people who are dependent upon government, often for understandable reasons, just how hard it's going to be for a political leader to be able to get the budget back under control. I suspect we need a period of public education about the situation and why it matters to them. If you look at Victoria, things are so bad now that I think the person on the street is starting to realise that there are problems, given that frontline services are having to be cut because they don't have enough money. But really, you don't want it to get that bad before you actually have to deliver, those kind of changes. So, what do you think about that situation?
Well, that's absolutely right, Dan. I think there are 2 points that everyone in public life, certainly everyone on the centre-right in public life, has got to stress. The first is that government doesn't create wealth, business creates wealth. That's the first point. And the second point is that government does not have a dollar to spend that it does not take off you, the taxpayer, either in taxes today or in taxes tomorrow to pay for today's borrowing. So these are the fundamental points. Now, I think a good government has a very clear fiscal rule. Certainly, when I was Prime Minister, this was the clear fiscal rule. In John Howard's time, this was the clear fiscal rule. There should be no new spending other than on national security and economic infrastructure, which is not paid for by reductions in existing spending. And this means that if Minister X suddenly gets the bright idea of spending more on project A, B or C, he or she has got to scour the portfolio and look for things where savings can be made, because it's easy to have a bright idea. It's easy to throw money at problems, but as I kept saying, both as a minister in the Howard government, as PM myself, it's easy to spend money. It's very hard to make a difference. And the whole point of being in government, the whole point of good government, is not just to splash cash on every problem, it's to make a difference. And funding more bureaucrats, charging around the countryside, on business class flights, going to meetings where they manage problems without really addressing them, it's just not what the public expect.
All right, well, let's look overseas now, and let's talk about Trump, what's happening there. First up, so you gave some comments, I think, when you were overseas recently, followed by an article in The Australian outlining your assessment of how it's going in America, and you gave a positive assessment to Trump's domestic agenda, whether it's to do with the diversity and equity and inclusion that he's getting rid of, or the getting out of the Paris Climate Agreement and other such matters. But you provided a less positive assessment of the foreign policy situation, encouraging America to stay engaged in the world, but also encouraging its allies to stay engaged in the world and to assist America and to lift their weight. So, Tony, this is, I think, a critical issue as we look at Ukraine and the Middle East and elsewhere. Can you give our audience sort of an overview of your assessment of where the Trump administration is at the moment?
Yeah, sure, Dan. And look, it's easy to cheer what Trump has done domestically. I think some of the foreign policy measures are a lot more problematic. I mean, I think it's terrific that he's pulled out of Paris. I think it's only sensible that he said drill, baby, drill. It's great that all this politically correct woke nonsense like the diversity, equity and inclusion agenda is being scrapped. It's great that he's insisting that there are only two genders, male and female, and that we can't buck biology. So a lot of good things there. Good that he's going to have another go at building the wall. So big tick to Donald Trump, who has been very brave and I think pretty much spot on when it comes to domestic policy. Good that he's going through the actual administration with a dose of salts, with Elon Musk helping him to ask every department and every public servant to justify their existence. I mean, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Foreign policy, different story. Now, in the end, I don't think Trump will want to go down in history as the guy who gave Putin Ukraine. I do not think Trump will want to start his foreign policy presidency this time round as the world's biggest loser who handed Ukraine on a platter to a vicious dictator. I don't think he will want to be to Putin and Russia what Neville Chamberlain was to Hitler and Germany over Czechoslovakia. Don't think he'll want that. But just at the moment, he does seem to be playing with fire a bit. I can absolutely understand him wanting the Europeans to step up. Of course they should step up. Of course they should be doing more for themselves. Yes, Britain and France in particular should be absolutely taking the lead on Ukraine. But any ceasefire that doesn't involve a substantial commitment of serious foreign forces to Ukraine so that Putin can never again do this without having to fight other serious countries as well as just the Ukrainians, it's effectively a sellout. It's effectively a surrender. So I hope that the President is thinking about the heroic people of Ukraine and their freedom, as well as just the burdens which America is quite understandably a little bit sick of bearing substantially on its own. The other point I'd make is that if there is a big win to Putin, that's going to embolden dictators everywhere, including the Chinese dictator, the communist commissars in Beijing, who have been casting covetous glances on practically independent, free and democratic Taiwan for a long time now. And to anyone who says America's got to focus on China and on the Asia Pacific, not on Europe, I say fair enough, but don't act in Europe in ways that might end up undermining your position in Asia. So these are very critical times. We've got to understand that China is, under the current government, is not our friend. And yes, I keep drawing a distinction between the Chinese Communist government, which is dead set on global domination, and the people of China, who are good people, like people everywhere, but do not underestimate just how set on regional and then global dominance Communist China is, and the fact that we've had a couple of Chinese warships sail down the east coast of Australia completely uninvited and engage in what can only be described as intimidatory live fire exercises without any official notice to the Australian government shows just how belligerent contemporary China is.
What do America's allies need to do, including Australia? The IPA, we've been calling for an increase in defence spending from 2 to 3% of GDP, and to make that spending much more targeted, effective and timely. I know Boris Johnson recently called for an increase in UK defence spending to 3% as well. So there's the spending side of it. I think there's also cultural self-confidence is a component of it as well. Just interested in your views in terms of whether it's Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. What do we need to be doing to support America and the broader democratic alliance?
Well, Dan, you're absolutely right that if we are to be taken seriously in Washington, we're going to have to do a lot more for ourselves. And while Britain in particular has been less bad than all the other allies, all of us, including Australia, have been substantially free riding on America for far too long. So yes, I think we should rapidly increase our defence spending up to 3% plus, the level that the Americans spend. But it's not just a question of spending, it's also a question of capability. In the end, a suitable military force is not whatever you get for a certain amount of money, it's what you need to keep the country safe. And plainly, we need more ships, we need more planes, we need more soldiers, and we need them as quickly as possible. The government has told us that we are monitoring the Chinese warships off our coast. There is, we're told in the press, a New Zealand frigate that's shadowing this Chinese task force. It's not clear whether there's actually an Australian ship monitoring it. I have no doubt that we would have planes in the air surveilling this task force, and some of our planes are equipped with offensive weaponry that could be used if needs be against this task force. But we really do need a much bigger navy. I mean, since the Albanese government has come in, we've cancelled an order for an additional squadron of F-35s. We've prematurely retired one Anzac-class frigate. We're on the verge of retiring more. Orders for additional frigates from Britain and most likely from Japan are a long way off delivery. We have got to treat this as a matter of quasi-wartime urgency. We've got to start re-equipping our Navy and our Air Force with the same urgency that the much maligned Neville Chamberlain did after Munich. I mean, we know that Chamberlain sold out the Czechs at Munich, but nevertheless, to his credit, he did massively increase British rearmament, massively increase the production of Spitfires and Hurricanes. That meant that when the Battle of Britain actually began, the Royal Air Force was at least in some condition to fight it and win it. Now, we've got to get our hands on more ships and more planes as quickly as we humanly can. There's a so-called reserve fleet that the Americans have got in Hawaii. I think we should be talking to the Americans about perhaps acquiring on a short-term basis some of those ships. The orders that we've been talking about for well over a year now for intermediate capability frigates need to be placed, and the speed of delivery needs to be massively ramped up. We've been talking now for at least 5 years about the ominous the ominous times in which we live. I mean, it was Scott Morrison who said probably 5 years ago now that these times resemble the late 1930s. Well, act with the urgency that the times demand. We've just got to get out of this complacency. We have just got to cease sleepwalking through Lotus Land, because the only language that bullies understand is strength, and the only way to preserve the peace that we all devoutly wish is through strength, not weakness.
Just sticking with the international front, interested just in partly in this context and partly to do with how things are changing in the Western world, your assessment of the German elections held over the weekend, which saw AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, get about 20% of the vote, and then the major centre-right party, CDU, got about 30% of the vote. Now, my understanding is that CDU has said that they do not want to govern with AfD, and they're going to partner with somebody else, presumably of the left, to form a coalition government. But we're seeing this across Europe for many years, whether it's in the Netherlands or France or Italy. There's obviously a yearning, sometimes by a majority, sometimes by a significant minority of voters, for some serious change to the direction of their countries over often migration, values, and basically the establishment. Just interested in your assessment, Tony, of the German elections and how you know, not just what it means for Germany, what does it mean for sort of continental Europe and the direction it's going?
Yeah, well, Dan, look, I'm not an expert on German politics, and I don't claim to be full bottle on the unique constitutional arrangements that apply in Germany. Douglas Murray said in passing at the ARC conference that we might get onto in a minute that for too long we've had eunuchs in charge, not real people. And I worry that the new Christian Democrat-led government will turn out to be another government of eunuchs. Their desire to do a deal with the Social Democrats, who were responsible for the drift and impotence of the last couple of years, really worries me. I accept that the AfD party is a bit of a mixed bag. Genuine committed conservatives plus perhaps a few rat bags. Well, my instinct, and again I stress I'm not an expert on German politics, rather than form a full-fledged coalition with the failed Social Democrats, why not try to enter into some kind of a confidence and supply agreement with the Alternative for Deutschland, where they are not your partners in government, but they agree to support what will be an unambiguously conservative government. And hopefully, if you were prepared to do a confidence and supply agreement, or the German equivalent thereof, that would be a way of bringing the AfD into the respectable right, rather than leaving them out in the wilderness in a way which, frankly, is just going to continue the alienation and the division that is marking so many Western polities. If a serious percentage of the public are very worried about something that the mainstream parties won't address, well, you will eventually get outbreaks on the extremes of the left, extremes of the right. It is absolutely incumbent on intelligent politicians of the centre to do what's necessary to address all serious problems, rather than denounce people who think they're serious problems as extremists just because they don't simply follow the conventional wisdom of yesterday.
Well, you mentioned the ARC conference, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which has held its second annual conference in London over the last week or so, and many luminaries of the right were there, yourself, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, who you mentioned, and many others besides. I think a lot of our audience would be broadly familiar with the idea of this conference, but probably don't know a whole lot about the details of it and what it's there to achieve and do. So can you give us a bit of an outline of what you learnt from the conference and sort of the direction that it's taking?
Well, thanks, Dan. Look, this is the second Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference. The first was in London in October 2023. The next is slated, I think, for June 2026. This is not your standard conference on politics, economics, or security. It's broader and deeper than that. We've sometimes talked in these podcasts about the fact that politics is downstream of culture and ultimately culture is downstream of faith. Well, ARC accepts that, and so really this was a discussion about the big cultural trends and the fundamental belief systems which are so important for the ongoing flourishing of Western civilization. I suppose the one thing that united the rather diverse group of people that got together in London last week is a sense that Western civilization is at a critical moment, a civilizational moment, if you like, that we do need to revive for our own sake and indeed for the sake of the wider world, and that in order to do that, we need to tell a better story about ourselves. I mean, you go to a typical university or classroom anywhere in the Anglosphere, and there'll be this dreadful angst. Americans' angst about slavery, Britain's angst about the empire, Australians' angst about Indigenous dispossession. And sure, all these things are true, but on balance, we are wonderful societies. And this idea that somehow we are blighted by racism, by sexism, by homophobia, by transphobia, by Islamophobia, wrong, wrong, wrong. No countries on earth are as least racist and more colourblind than ours. And we should celebrate the fact that we have done so much good for the world, and that's what the conference was all about. So as well as people like myself, I guess I'm a pretty standard centre-right conservative. There was Jordan Peterson, who was not really a political animal at all, is still not really a political animal. He's, I think, a cultural phenomenon who has really acted as a complete inspiration, particularly to a new generation of young men who know that they do not suffer from toxic masculinity and needed someone to reassure them that being a strong and virile young man is a good thing, not a bad thing. You had people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the former Muslim who was put under a fatwa for her role in the politics of Holland. A wonderful, inspirational woman, Barry Weiss, formerly of the New York Times, who resigned after basically anyone who wasn't of the centre left or even the green left was cancelled on what was once a great newspaper. So it was a pretty eclectic group. And I would certainly recommend to anyone who hasn't that they listen to Douglas Murray's wonderful speech, to Ayaan Hirsi Ali's wonderful speech, to Brooks of the New York Times, one of the, I suppose, few non-green left people left on the New York Times. Barry Weiss, again, another terrific contribution. Konstantin Kisin, who is a Russian immigrant to Britain, whose most recent book is An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. There are a lot of really interesting and I think very thought-provoking and insightful presentations that the sort of people who listen to our discussions, Dan, I think would benefit immensely from listening to.
Yeah, I'd encourage people to have a look. I didn't go to the London one this most recent time or the one before, but they did have an offshoot in Sydney last year that I had the opportunity to go to. It was a much more, I guess, modest affair, one day rather than 3 days and so forth. But what's critical, I think, about ARC and other conferences like it is to actually outline the cultural challenges in a very forthright manner and to do so in a manner that's not beholden to day-to-day politics. The trouble with a lot of conferences is you get the usual politicians that come, and they're sort of beholden to the political lines of the day, and whatever their beliefs might be in private, they're reluctant often to push the boat out. But I certainly heard, I think it was Philippa Shroud talk about family policy and the critical importance there, and I think that's an area that the centre-right needs to become more comfortable, because it's at the moment it's just more money for the same childcare arrangements that just do not suit the modern family. Those are the kind of discussions I like to see at these conferences.
And we need to face up to the fact that not all immigrants are equal. I mean, this is not a religious or ethnic thing, but a doctor from Ireland, for argument's sake, is going to make a much better contribution to Australia than an Islamist from Gaza, and without running a discriminatory immigration policy on the basis of race or culture, I think we need to have a immigration policy that takes values into account. I mean, the whole point of that citizenship test that the Howard government brought in, and the fact that there are 5 Australian values questions that you were supposed to pass, is an acknowledgement of the importance of values and a civic patriotism, if not necessarily an ethnic patriotism, if countries like ours are to flourish. So yeah, there was a lot that was incredibly refreshing and much broader than your standard political event or standard conference talking about the standard things from the standard people.
Well, I think, Tony, we'll leave it there for today. You're a man in demand, and you're off to the airport shortly. So we appreciate you taking the time to continue these chats, and we'll be back in about a fortnight.
I look forward to that very much, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.